Hello, everyone. I've written and talked many times about the universally banal and superficial portrayal of UFOs in our media. It's not something that has happened for just a few years, but has happened for decades and indeed our entire lifetimes. I often come back to it because it's something that I would say is fundamental to the situation of UFOs in general. That is, you've got the phenomenon itself. There's countless sightings and experiences by people from every element of our society of things that just simply do not make sense. And yes, clearly a very large majority of those types of experiences undoubtedly do have explanations that are logical, ultimately conventional. Whatever that percentage is, no one really knows. Is it 90%, 95%, 99.9%? Maybe only 75% or even less. No one really knows because no one, or I would say nearly no one, has taken the time to do any kind of detailed investigative study. Not the believers, not the skeptics. Yet from my perspective anyway, there's more than enough truly difficult cases with impeccable eyewitnesses, lots of data that tell us there are things in this world. They surely seem technological that are well beyond the upper limits of what human civilization is supposed to have been able to create. Now, my interest started back in the 1990s by focusing mainly on the military encounters with UFOs. That's interesting for several reasons. It's not that encounters by ordinary people are somehow less interesting scientifically or experientially. I wouldn't say that at all. But it's that military encounters are really interesting for several reasons. A, militaries are connected to our governments, so that means interaction in theory by our governing bodies. B, militaries are responsible for national defense. C, militaries have capabilities that ordinary people or civilian groups just don't have. Like militaries can track these things. They can fly up to engage them. They can even try to shoot them down. And finally, militaries leave a paper trail. It's not a complete trail, and of course, so much of that paper trail is classified. But even so, we've been able to read quite a lot of that paper trail over the years, and it's been invaluable in helping us to piece together a semblance of a history of this phenomenon over the past 70 plus years. What's come down very, very clearly, and you can only appreciate what I'm saying here if you have taken the time to acquaint yourself with some of this declassified and additional documentation. But what's come down very clearly is that there is what we would call extreme technology that's been traversing this world for a while now. Maybe a very long while, but certainly through the 20th and 21st centuries. And that's an easy argument to make. So it's real. It's important. And our militaries have been engaging it for a long time, and not just the U.S. military. No, all of them, or at least all of them that have any significant capability. And without getting too sidetracked on my main topic, I just want to point out that although there are roughly 200 or so legally sovereign nations, in terms of military spending, the top 10 nations account for about 3/4 of all military spending in the world. By itself, the U.S. accounts for almost 40%. China is trying to catch up, but it's going to take them a while. They're just under 10%. Saudi Arabia comes in number 3, and then there's Russia, which spends about 1/10 of what the U.S. spends on its military. They're number 4. But anyway, roughly a handful of nations have militaries with enough money, enough infrastructure, enough capability to do much of anything about UFOs. And this is why nearly all of them, excepting Russia and China, defer to the U.S. in this area. In the international world, it's been the U.S. game for a long time now, which is why, incidentally, most nations have not dared to come out on the matter of UFOs ahead of the United States. Most of them are utterly controlled, and most of the rest are deeply influenced. And there are a couple of exceptions and wildcards: Russia, China, maybe Iran, maybe North Korea. That's about it. Now, I mention all of this to point out that power is greatly centralized in this world. Power by the United States to control its allies. And here is what I now want to shift gears to. centralized power over controlling the narrative of this phenomenon in a way that is safe and manageable to the top of the world power structure. So control over the narrative is the most important thing of all. That is control over information. Controlling information for others, well, that means, let's just break this down and think about it. Control over information means that you have information that can be very important, vital, but you decide how to distribute, how to disseminate that information. You decide who gets to have that information, and you end up having to fight an information war because you know full well that other groups, whether they be other nations or your own people, well, they can be very smart at times, right? And sometimes people figure things out that you don't want them to know. And if you doubt that there are reasons why some people would not want this UFO information to come out in the open, then, well, you have not been paying attention. I'll just say that. Back in the 1950s, there were special challenges to managing UFO information. In some ways, it was easier than today. In some ways, a little more difficult. One thing that made it more difficult was that the press and radio, what we would today call mainstream media, was not nearly as centralized as it is today. Consolidation has been going on for a long time. Now, today, we hear all the time that there's 5 corporations that control 90% of all media that you encounter in your daily life. I think we need to revise that a little bit, but that's fundamentally true. Back in 1950, I don't know how many corporations controlled 90%, but it was probably several hundred. We know in 1983, it was 50 companies. So the thing is, with that many more independent voices in the media back in the 50s, there was always more of a chance of some independent coverage. And that's exactly what did happen. You go back to newspaper articles of the 1950s, and you'll find a lot of newspaper coverage, especially local coverage of the subject of UFOs and flying saucers. It's quite amazing, really. So that was the challenging part back then. But what made it a bit easier to control was the fact that, well, in the first place, the U.S. intelligence community had a very cozy relationship with the biggest media conglomerates of the time. We're talking New York Times, Washington Post. They have always been in the back pocket of U.S. national security interests. And you can see this by their totally sycophantic coverage of UFOs and for U.S. imperial interests for 70 years. And also, of course, the major radio and the television corporations. This was Operation Mockingbird. Talked about this many, many times. We've known about this for a long time. So control wasn't complete, but it was effective enough. The big thing is that back then there was no internet. And the internet has made everything different. There is no question that back in, say, 1985, the internet of today could have never have been predicted. There's no way. Maybe a few bare bones parameters people might have been able to see in the future, but no one was foreseeing the world we have today. The ability of anyone truly to talk to anyone else, essentially anywhere in the world, to copy and paste information and to create something else, to create a citizen-based information network. People from around the world realized they didn't have to be professionally trained journalists to write news and to give their perspectives. We call this alternative news, but that's not really the best term for it, because this so-called alternative news has become far, far more engaging than the information we get from the companies owned by AT&T, Comcast, Disney, Charter Communications, CBS, Viacom, News Corp. Those are the top media corporations, or the top ones that we always hear about. And they do pretty much control everything mainstream, except there are a couple of other big guys now who are every bit as big as the big boys and sometimes even bigger. We're talking Alphabet Inc., which is Google's parent company. Of course, they own YouTube. Then there's Facebook, which has slightly more revenue than News Corp and is right in there with Disney and Charter Communications. And then there's also Amazon, which makes the top 10 in terms of global media, just a little bit down the list from companies like Sony. So at least in terms of revenue, okay, that's the numbers that I'm looking at. So what we have seen happen is that the internet has gone from being the Wild West of the early 1990s and early 2000s to something very corporatized, something very mainstream, and looking more and more like television. Alphabet, that is Google's company, and Facebook all have strong connections with the US intelligence community. It's widely discussed that Google itself was a pet creation of the CIA. And yes, you could Google that, or better, use DuckDuckGo, but you can find that information. The point is that the fox was let back into the henhouse over the last decade or more, and we are seeing a definite, and I would say in many ways a successful counterattack on freedom of information by these hierarchies that seek above all else control of information. Who gets access to what kind of information is very important to them. Now, obviously, we see this in the new form of censorship taking place everywhere in the world, and especially online and in places like Facebook and YouTube, where deplatforming has been accelerating in the name of protecting you from bad ideas, because they call that hateful ideas and hate speech, which is because why should you ever encounter, much less speak, ideas that some people don't like and make them upset? Clearly, this movement is a thinly veiled attempt to restrict what is permissible speech in a society and permissible thought within a society. And we'll see how far this can go. Hopefully, brave citizens will continue to fight this with all of their strength of being. But back to UFOs. It's a subject that's always been of paramount national security. It's been something that's caused great headache and worry to those people seeking to contain information about it. From the days of Operation Mockingbird and the Robertson panel in the 1950s until today. Some people think that we're in a different era today regarding the release of UFO information, disclosure, right, as we all call it. Now, I've believed for years that the world is changing way too fast, and at some point, something's going to come out in terms of this subject. In other words, the changes are happening too fast to be able to contain the UFO subject. And so that something will happen, there'll be an undeniable leak, and then an avalanche of some sort will occur, some kind of uncontrolled release of information, and then the world will be different, maybe overnight. Now, I've believed this for quite some time, but it seems to me that I have had to revise my opinion on this matter. And I have revised my opinion on this matter because it's become obvious to me that UFOs are slowly, very slowly, being disclosed to us. This is not an overnight thing. This is not via accidental leaks. No, this is controlled. We are seeing a form of controlled disclosure. So consider the now famous article from the New York Times of December 16th, 2017. Two articles actually in one day on UFOs. This was an astonishing turnaround for the New York Times. New York Times was a publication that for years and years had only invective and sarcasm and snarkiness and hostility toward the subject of UFOs. That was their only attitude. And suddenly a complete turnaround. That's interesting. Another interesting thing to ask is, why no follow-up? Do you realize it's been a year and a half since that article has come out, and there has not been one significant piece of follow-up journalism, not from the New York Times, and really not from any other major mainstream organization since. Some good regional media, yes, but nothing on the level of the New York Times or any kind of national or international media. And the question is why, or why not? Why not? Why no follow-up? Well, I think the answer is because the New York Times was never serious, ever, about promoting genuine disclosure on UFOs. But rather than to, their goal was to drop information, a bit of information out there, mostly true information in those two articles, mixed in with a few things that were not true, and then also intentionally holding back a whole lot more in order to make a limited change in our society, to change the discussion and to move it forward in a certain direction, and most definitely to control the direction of that discussion. At the same time, there are organizations like TTSA out there making their push for greater openness on the subject. Now, I want to make something clear. I am not trashing TTSA, but what we are seeing through them and other sources is a definite rebranding of UFOs. And it's a rebranding of it from the phrase UFO to the phrase UAP, that is unknown aerial phenomenon. And we've really been seeing this since roughly 2015, as far as I can tell. It really took off in 2015 and 2016. And it finally occurred to me why this has been so. And the reason, I believe, is that for us to have an open discussion of UFOs to take place, there's a lot of baggage that comes with that discussion. If you use the phrase UFO, baggage like cover-up, baggage like alien beings and abductions, baggage like crash retrievals and back-engineered technology. See, if you bring up UFOs, those other topics inevitably will arise in the discussion. But if you change it to UAP, what we are seeing is the people who are talking about this can say, or are trying to say, there's something out there. We don't know what it is, but we need to investigate, and so on. And this is exactly what you're hearing. Now, it's an understandable position, actually, when you try to see it from their point of view. If you're trying to disclose this reality and you recognize that it's an explosive subject, which it is, then you might feel the need to do this as gradually and as easily and as scare-free as you can. Now, I never thought it could be done like this. I never thought it could be possible for, let's call them the secret keepers, to be able to do this without losing control of the situation. But in fact, so far, they are doing it by a combination of rebranding and maintaining control over the media. That includes marginalizing unapproved themes from YouTube and Facebook, deplatforming, or at least de-incentivizing by demonetizing, and especially de-ranking. This is a big thing, and it's been happening in Google searches and YouTube searches very distinctively lately. So when you try, for example, to search something related to UFOs or really any other topic considered bad or fringe by the establishment, then what you find is that you're increasingly led to corporate sources and videos in your searches. So we're talking NBC, New York Times, Washington Post, CNN, Fox, and so on. It's really shocking nowadays that how blatantly obvious the mainstream direction of these searches happens to be. So rather than seeing the news of citizen websites or alternative media, which is where all the real information and action has always been. So by deranking and by guiding or curating, as they love to say nowadays, your results, this is part of their way of controlling the narrative, by controlling the flow of information. Now, they're not at a point of 100% control yet, but it's vastly more pronounced now than it was even a year or two ago. And in fact, they have to do this. I mean, Google has to do this, because if they don't skew the rankings like this in favor of establishment sources, they would lose in a heartbeat. In a heartbeat. In other words, they can only win by cheating. In a fair search, people would gravitate to the best sources, and those best sources are not your mainstream sites. Good God, who goes to YouTube in order to find more television news? It's absurd, but that's what's happening more and more. So this is a new form of censorship that's happening, and it's hand in glove with a slow, deliberate, measured, controlled form of UFO disclosure that is, I believe, that is happening. Now, you might ask, why is any form of disclosure happening, right? It's a fair question. Well, I would say that it's happening because some form of disclosure is becoming inevitable. Too much is happening, too many changes, too much unpredictability. To continue to control this subject, it's going to be necessary for those people who have had knowledge of this for all these years. It's necessary for them to continue to get out in front of it and to control the narrative as much as possible. And I believe that is what we're seeing. And again, this isn't to trash TTSA. I would say the disclosure part of what they are trying to do is good. The controlled part is dangerous. So the disclosure part is good. The controlled part is dangerous, to say the least. It's not just them. This is part of a very, very coordinated effort, clearly. And again, we can understand why the control is there if we want to see it in a certain way. But I would leave you with this. Controlling the truth under any circumstances is a questionable way to make our world a better place. We are only served by a free flow of information because that's the only way we can make ourselves better. You can't make the world a better place, and you can't make yourself a better person through deceit and through illusions. The truth is a painful path, because to go down that path means you have to shed the illusions that you become attached to in the course of your life. But it is the truth, and it is only the truth that can ever set us free. Now, I'll be back on this subject again in the future. I have much more to say on it. For now, I'm going to wrap it up, and I just want to thank you for being here with me. And we'll do this again the next time. And just one last thing. If you like what you see here, please do help by subscribing to this YouTube channel. It really helps me. And please click notifications, because you don't want to miss new broadcasts and videos here. And I will just say thanks for being here with me, and to stay smart, stay brave, and never stop asking questions. Thanks again. Later.